I'm still in Switzerland on my vacation, which, as I said, makes it a little business with a lot of pleasure. And as with all my recent programs, this will be a relatively short program compared to the ones that I generally do in London. I'm sure some of you will find that, well, better. But anyway, there we are. So if we turn back to this major topic of discussion, which is the conflict in Ukraine, we continue to see overall stability on all the recent front lines. There's been very little movement in Zaporozhye. Russian officials, Lieutenant Colonel Marochko, for example, have confirmed that there's been heavy fighting in the Bakhmut area, the area of the town of what is now called by the Russians Artyomsk. By the way, I understand that it remains completely deserted of inhabitants and is badly wrecked and very damaged. But anyway, there's been fighting there. Ukraine has been trying to push towards places like Klesheyevka and Kordyumovka to the southwest, to the south and west of Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut. It's so far not managed to capture either of these two settlements. And as I said, the fighting remains intense. And Marochko said that so far all attempts by Ukraine to achieve a breakthrough or significant gains in this area have been unsuccessful, but the fighting remains as intense as it has ever been. Further north in Kupiansk, Marochko said that the Russians are now busy building trenches near Kupiansk, which suggests to me again that they are expecting not just some kind of Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, but that they're now working towards an investment of the town, an encirclement of it, of the same sort that they've carried out near Avdiivka and in other places. And I should say that if we're talking about Avdiivka, there have been Ukrainian counterattacks there. Apparently, according to Russian officials, they've not been successful. The Daily Telegraph, about a week ago, claimed that Ukraine had recaptured some ground near Krasnogorovka, ground which it had essentially lost in 2014. It admitted that this territory which had been captured was very small and that the Ukrainians had made no announcement about this at the time when they allegedly captured it. I have to say that not a single Russian war correspondent, blogger, commentator has mentioned this advance, and I'm deeply skeptical that it has happened. Given the kind of people who cover the war on the Russian side, I'm confident that if there had been an attack or an advance by Ukraine of that nature, I would have known about it pretty much immediately when it took place. I would add that I've noticed an increasing tendency, especially in the British media, that they now hold back from reporting Ukrainian advances until the Russians themselves, until the same Russian commentariat confirms their existence. And I would also say, by the way, that this is, for me, further validation that even the British have quietly come to accept that these war bloggers, commentators, reporters on the Russian side give us a reasonably accurate picture of what is going on the battlefronts. Now, that doesn't mean that their opinions are necessarily correct. One must always allow for their political biases. But as I said, one must separate biases and commentary from actual reporting. And their reporting up to this point has been, as far as I can see, reasonably accurate. On the southern front lines, where Ukraine's offensive was supposed to take place and where Ukraine made its major push at the start of June, things appear to be quiet and stable. I say quiet, that's not really the case at all. Fighting continues there pretty much all the time, but as I said, it's there's been no major Ukrainian attacks of the kind that we saw at the beginning of this month. And there continue to be lots of reports about this small group of Ukrainian fighters who've occupied an island, or so I understand, near the Antonovsky Bridge, and who've been using the Antonovsky Bridge to give themselves cover from Russian attacks. Now, the Russians have tried to destroy this part of the bridge, which has been providing the Ukrainians with this kind of cover, by launching against it 1,500 kilo glide bombs. Apparently, they've only managed a limited amount of damage to the bridge, which I consider, by the way, a vindication to the points I was making last summer and autumn, which is that HIMARS missile strikes on a bridge of that nature were hardly likely to cause it any major or sustained or structural damage. Well, these big bombs apparently did only a limited amount of damage. We've now seen pictures of an Iskander missile strike on this particular part of the bridge. The pictures are very evocative and rather frightening, and they may suggest that in fact the bridge itself, this part of the bridge, has now been destroyed, in which case one can only say that the fate of these Ukrainian soldiers must be, well, a very grisly one. Now that brings me to an article that I read yesterday. It's in various parts of the Russian and Ukrainian media, and it comes from a Ukrainian institute, an institute in Kiev. They've done a sociological survey. They've been asking people in Ukraine whether they know anybody who is either been killed or wounded over the course of this conflict. Now, they do this kind of survey on a regular basis. The first part of the survey was done in the autumn. 9%, I think, at that time said that they did know someone. In the early part of this year, that had risen to 17%. It's now grown to a horrifying 78%. And from what I can understand, around 64% of respondents said that they knew someone who's close to them, a member of their family or a friend, who'd actually been killed. And in most cases, the average of those they knew who'd actually been killed, not killed and wounded, but just killed, was 3. Now, I mean, this points to horrifying losses on the part of Ukraine in this war. And I would say that, as I understand it, this survey was completed on the 5th of June. So whilst it takes into account the Battle of Bakhmut, where a very high proportion of these losses must have been incurred, it doesn't take into account the recent offensive which Ukraine has launched, where my overall sense is that the losses might be higher still. And I do ask myself whether decision makers in the West and in other places fully understand the scale of the human disaster that is now unfolding in Ukraine. And I must also say that I'm rather shocked that I have seen no reference to this survey, which I would reiterate again, comes from a Kiev institute. I've seen no reference to this survey in any section of the British media that I have checked. I think that if the public in the West was made aware of what was going on in Ukraine, of the scale of the losses there, then that would have a political effect. And I think that people in the West do deserve to know about this. Anyway, in the meantime, to reiterate again, there's been much talk about security guarantees for Ukraine in the Vilnius summit. Latest information, a statement which I've seen from European Union officials, speaks of various options being considered, which I take to be a sign that there is no agreement on this issue for the moment either. There's no understanding or acceptance or agreement as to exactly what the nature of these supposed security guarantees, which, to reiterate again, the West will be giving to Ukraine unilaterally without agreement with the Russians, and which are intended to provide the Ukrainians with some kind of, well, let's say it, sop for the fact that they're not going to get NATO membership in any future period. Anyway, it seems to me that there is no agreement amongst Western countries as to what these security guarantees are going to be. And I think that there is an explanation for this, a very simple explanation. What Western countries do not want to do, or at least some Western countries do not want to do, is to give Ukraine security guarantees, which might, however, draw them into an outright conflict with Russia. So the result is that the security guarantees, when they are eventually provided, will be a great deal less than what they appear to provide on the surface. They will provide a passport for more Western military supplies to Ukraine, perhaps the deployment of some Western troops to Ukraine, but probably so far in relatively limited numbers. I can't help but think that before very long, what we're going to see is some attempt in the West to create not so much security guarantees encompassing all the Western states, but rather an attempt by the United States, another attempt by the United States to create what might be called a coalition of the willing. Poland, some of the Baltic states, conceivably Romania, though I understand that there's little enthusiasm for any of this in Romania, countries that will be happy to send troops to Ukraine, risk getting drawn into some kind of conflict with Russia, but who will be told, in effect, that if a conflict with Russia does take place, they're on their own, that they will be left to do as best they can against the Russian army in the event that it comes for them. Now, all of this is very dismal, and given the fact that we're also looking, as I said, at a situation where there is no agreement on security guarantees, and clearly little hope of a Ukrainian breakthrough in the conflict, I would say that it ought to concentrate minds. The fact that there's no agreement about these matters, no agreement about who the new NATO Secretary General should be, I think that this is something that people need to take a step back in the West, think about, and ask themselves whether, in fact, the better way, the more logical way, is not to try to deal unilaterally with this situation, but to enter into a proper negotiation with the Russians, which will obviously mean concessions about the situation in Europe and the security situation in Europe. It might have been a difficult thing to agree to for some Western leaders. It was what the Western leaders refused to agree to back in 2021 and 2022 when the Russians proposed their draft treaties. But it seems to me that if this crisis is to be ended in a sustainable way, it is what must be faced and what must be done. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, I had not intended to return to the topic of the Prigozhin affair, but inexorably I am drawn back to doing so. Now, I'd like to say a few things, firstly, about the Surovikin stories that are now circulating in the Western media. Last night, notwithstanding clear denials, both from the Kremlin, from Dmitry Peskov, and from Surovikin's daughter, that Surovikin, well, in the case of his daughter, she clearly, straightforwardly said in an interview that she gave to a Russian radio station, which I understand is connected with the Russian internal security agencies in some ways. Anyway, Surovikin's daughter said quite straightforwardly that he is free and well, and that he is continuing to carry out his work on the battlefronts. And in fact, I would suggest that we actually saw evidence of this last night. There was another major missile and drone strike over Ukraine over the course of last night. These are now, frankly speaking, regular events. And given that Surovikin is the chief of Russia's aerospace forces, I would have thought that it's the kind of thing that he would probably be managing and supervising. But nonetheless, notwithstanding these denials, and by the way, there's been statements in some parts of the Western media that the Kremlin is silent about Surovikin and what's happened. But as I said, Peskov straightforwardly said that as far as he was concerned, all of these stories that are appearing in the Western media are stories that one shouldn't take seriously, and I treat that as a denial. Anyway, notwithstanding all of this, I noticed that yesterday the Financial Times and I believe the Associated Press were hardening with the story that in fact Surovikin is indeed under arrest, that he is being questioned, that he is subject to some kind of interrogation process, just on the assumption that he's in some way implicated with the Prigozhin affair, notwithstanding that on Saturday he made a strong and very clear statement which appeared on the Russian Ministry of Defense's website, telling Prigozhin and the troops that were supporting him to basically stand down and return to their bases, and saying that he'd actually had to leave the front lines to try to supervise the situation, no doubt the work of the aerospace forces. Anyway, he made it absolutely clear at that point that he was not in any way in agreement with this mutiny, and that he was, on the contrary, vigorously and very strongly opposed to it. But anyway, the Western media continue to plug this story, and I have to say, I've seen nothing, there is absolutely nothing there in these articles which convinces me that this story is true. And I would suggest that this is, to some extent, a case of some people trying to keep the story alive, or to be more precise, to keep the myth alive that this affair, the Prigozhin affair, was a more serious crisis for the Russian government than it obviously was, and that in fact Putin and the Russian government did indeed face a serious and sustained crisis when Prigozhin and his troops, or at least some of his troops, mutinied, and that there are indeed cracks and divisions within the Russian political and military system. As I have pointed out on several occasions, there is absolutely no evidence of this, not a single person of any importance in Russia. Indeed, hardly anyone of limited importance in Russia came out and supported Prigozhin. Every single senior official, military, civilian official came out and strongly supported President Putin. The Communist Party supported President Putin. The Communist Party's leader, Gennady Zyuganov, gave a very strong statement on Saturday, making it absolutely clear that the Communist Party stood fully behind Putin in the face of this affair. The entire political system, the entire military system, the security services, everybody stood behind Putin, as of course did Surovikin in that broadcast that I've discussed. But nonetheless, some people in the West are keen to argue the contrary, and I suspect that is the entire explanation for the Surovikin affair. They're running with this story for as long as they can. Of course, when Surovikin reappears, assuming he does reappear, well, at that point, of course, the story will be dropped, and most likely we won't hear anything, and we're most unlikely to hear retractions. But anyway, that's, it seems to me, what that's all about. But there have been two very interesting articles about this affair which have now appeared, and one, interestingly, is in The Guardian, and it's by Anatol Lieven, a regular writer for Responsible Statecraft. In the past, I've always found him an interesting and insightful and astute commentator on Russian foreign policy, and indeed sometimes, though not always, on Russian domestic policy. I think that on military matters, he's got things, well, much more wrong, and I'm going to say that on the military matters, on the course of the war, I fundamentally disagree with what he says most of the time, and I think his support for the sanctions war that the Biden administration has launched against Russia, well, I'm going to say that I think it is misconceived. Anyway, but he did write an interesting piece in The Guardian, first clear-cut article in The Guardian, one which flatly contradicts the entire thesis promoted across The Guardian, across nearly the entire spectrum of the British media. He says straightforwardly and simply that the Prigozhin affair does not show the weakness of President Putin's position, the political weakness of President Putin's position, or of that of his government. What it shows instead is its strength. And I'm going to say at this point that I found the article interesting in one other respect, in that not only does the article echo points which I have made many, many times in all of my various programs, the various programs that I've been making about this affair, the Prigozhin affair, but I was interested to see words appearing in this article that seemed extremely close to my own. And anyway, just to come to the article itself, he says the conclusions that Putin has been weakened are coloured by an understandable in the West, dislike of the Russian leader, and they do not constitute sober and objective analysis. And he then goes on to say it became apparent that there was going to be no mutiny in support of Wagner within the regular army. Prigozhin was faced with the choice of an attack on Moscow that would almost certainly have led to the slaughter of his men and his own death, or a surrender on terms. In these circumstances, Putin had nothing to gain by seeking violent revenge. He had everything to gain by showing magnanimity. He had, after all, won. And he then goes on to say that he then goes on to discuss Putin's references to 1917 and to the fact that the situation, the memory of 1917 is one that Russians are anxious to avoid, and that they will not want to be a repeat on those events, and that Putin's comments about this will have played a significant role in strengthening support for Putin over the course of this affair. Now, you may remember that was also my analysis when I passed Putin's speech shortly after it was made on a video that I made at the time on Saturday, or rather on Sunday, shortly after Putin had spoken in the way that he had. Anyway, that's Anatol Lieven, and as I say, it's interesting to see that at least someone in the West recognises the political realities, and that just occasionally it just peeps through. We see a story, an article appearing in the British media which acknowledges the reality, the objective analysis, the objective facts, as Anatol Lieven calls them, and, well, it's probably not going to alter the overall British narrative of this affair, but I do suspect that it does reflect a wider understanding that probably does exist in Britain about the realities. Otherwise, this article surely would not have been published. The other article which has also appeared is by Scott Ritter, and this is a completely different article. That Scott Ritter has discussed extensively the whole Prigozhin affair, and he's also discussed a great deal about the history of Wagner and how it was set up and how its origins can be traced back to the work of Russian military intelligence, the organization the West refers to as the GRU. He suggests that the events that led to the creation of Wagner date from 2014, the events in Crimea and in Donbass in that year, and that this is when the Russian authorities decided that they needed an organization that would exist, which was separate from Russian state structures, but that they could control and which they could deploy in various hotspots around the world, in Donbass at that time, in Syria, in Africa, in other places, whilst giving themselves plausible deniability about their own involvement. And that is so close, in fact, so identical to the information that I've been getting from the source close to the Wagner organization, who has been providing me with information. And I have to say, I do wonder whether perhaps the same source is providing the same information to Scott Ritter, who, of course, as a former intelligence officer, is in a much better position to analyse and understand this information than perhaps I am. But having said that, there is a great deal more in this article than that. There are two specific points that Scott Ritter makes, which I found interesting. One, I've come across previously, and this has also been provided to me by the same source. And this source has in the past discussed the fact that Prigozhin may have been engaged in various criminal activities, not just in his past life. He has, after all, served 9 years in prison, but also using elements of the Wagner organization in order to promote his own interests, and using the Wagner organization to, or at least elements within it, to promote those interests in a criminal manner. And I hadn't discussed this previously because, well, I don't want to say more than I know. As I said, it came from one source, and besides, I didn't want to say anything that might lead to a disclosure of the source. But anyway, we see now that Scott Ritter is reporting the same thing, and maybe he's got this from the same source, but quite possibly he's got it from another source as well. And I'm afraid this is a rather ugly picture. It suggests trading in diamonds, blood diamonds in Africa, all kinds of activities, which, well, it would be most disastrous. It's most disastrous that Prigozhin, if Prigozhin was indeed involved in them. I'm going to say that until and unless there is a proper criminal case and investigation of all of these activities, I'm going to mention all of this, but I'm going to park it to one side. Prigozhin has just come out the loser in a power struggle. So I think that it's possible that these stories are now being spread publicly in order to damage his reputation, and that they may not actually be true. It's possible. He is, after all, not been tried, and one should always assume innocence unless guilt is proven. But anyway, I will say that these allegations are now appearing, and at least Scott Ritter appears to give credence to them. But the other aspect of this story, the most interesting one, is about the motivations behind the mutiny. And it is clear that the relationship between Prigozhin and the Defense Ministry began to break down back in September, when Donbass voted to become part of the Russian Federation. And at that point, the Russian government acceded to its request, and Donbass was indeed assimilated into the Russian Federation, annexed, as the Ukrainians would say. And as Scott Ritter correctly points out, that put Wagner and Prigozhin in a very difficult position, because Russian law prohibits the operation of private military companies like Wagner on Russian territory. And from that point onward, Wagner became a private military company, which, so far as the Russian authorities were concerned, was operating on Russian territory. And from this point onwards, the Russian authorities were starting to put heavy pressure on Prigozhin and on the rest of Wagner to sort out their legal position, to agree contracts with the Russian government, which would in effect have absorbed Wagner fully into the Russian armed forces. And Prigozhin wasn't happy about this. He'd, up to this point, been able to use Wagner, not just to carry out, as I said, the wishes of the Russian authorities in places like Africa, Donbass and the rest, but as a sideline. He'd been able to use Wagner, both perhaps criminally, but also legally, through contracts he'd made with African leaders. He'd been able to enrich himself through its activities. And so he pushed back very hard against all this pressure from the Russian government to absorb Wagner, roll Wagner into the Russian armed forces. And it was this that led to the collapse of his relationship with the Russian Ministry of Defense. His initial claims that he was being starved of ammunition, his constant abuse of Shoigu and Gerasimov, his allegations of corruption, of all of those things. And Scott Ritter says that in February, and again, Scott Ritter says this unambiguously, it's not something that he writes about as if he didn't know. He writes about this as if it was an objective fact. He says that in February, Prigozhin came into contact with the Ukrainian intelligence agencies, that this was initially done to discuss a possible coup attempt by ex-Wagner fighters in Moldova, which is a curious affair in itself. I'm not going to comment about that now, but that's an interesting sideline on things. But apparently, over the course of these discussions, and Scott Ritter allows also for the possibility that the British might also have been involved. either directly or indirectly through Ukrainian intelligence, and perhaps through London-based former Russian oligarchs bitterly hostile to Putin, who might also have got in touch with Prigozhin. Anyway, that it was an accumulation of information or advice from these people who persuaded Prigozhin that if he launched his coup or his attempted coup, that the entire Russian political, military and civilian leadership would fall into place on his side, and that he would achieve the objective that he sought. And that this is what, in fact, led to this affair. Now, again, I have to say this is a very interesting article. I don't know Scott Ritter's sources. I would point out that he has been in Russia recently. He has actually met Wagner fighters there. And of course, he is a former intelligence officer. He is in a position to assess this information. I'm confident that his account of events is correct. And it does appear to confirm that Prigozhin was indeed in touch with Ukrainian intelligence. I think it was an article in the Wall Street Journal, which back in March essentially said as much. So I think we can take that as reasonably sure. And that this is what led to the events, that this was this combination of events that led to the crisis that we saw. And it was all basically about Prigozhin trying to protect his interests as the titular head of the Wagner organization, as the titular owner of the Wagner organization. For him, it was a money-making enterprise. Perhaps he had emotional feelings invested in it as well. The one should not be excluded simply because the other might also exist. But one way or the other, he probably felt that after September, his business was being expropriated, and like all Russian oligarchs, he pushed back and did so in a spectacular and ultimately disastrously self-destructive way. And I think this is about as complete and good an account of the Prigozhin affair as one is ever likely to find. I don't think that there is any better explanation of what happened than this one, and I would certainly suggest that people read Scott Ritter's account and, as I said, form their own views. Now it brings me back to the topic of what's going to happen with the Wagner fighters in Belarus. The suggestion now is that they're going to be engaged in training Belarusian troops. They're not apparently going to be used to conduct military operations themselves. And as I said, I suspect that before very long, they will indeed be decanted to Africa, where Prigozhin will probably go himself and will be able to continue on a much more limited scale, obviously, his business. Though I suspect it will no longer be based in Russia anymore. The Russian authorities have told him, apparently, that he must close down all his business activities in Russia. He's been given, I believe, a month in which to do that. Now, that I think probably is the last we're going to hear of this affair, at least for the time being. I doubt that it is going to be the last we're going to hear about Prigozhin himself. As I've said before, I think that he's the kind of person who bears his grievances strongly. It is only a question of time before they start to be transferred to Putin himself. And I personally, despite doubts, which I do have about this, but I personally would nonetheless not be surprised if at some point Prigozhin ended up in the West, perhaps in London. We shall see. Anyway, in the meantime, there have been some further comments by Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia. He has made certain comments about the state of the conflict. He says that Ukraine has now run through almost the entirety of its former Soviet arsenal and of all the former Soviet weapons supplied to it by the West. It now depends entirely on handouts of weapons by the West to continue the war. I think all of that we have probably worked out for ourselves. But perhaps most importantly and most worryingly for the West, for the West and for Ukraine, he's also said that for the Russians, a peace agreement between themselves and Ukraine on the lines that was agreed between, or almost agreed, between Russia and Ukraine on the 29th of March last year is no longer acceptable. That Russian demands are going to go well beyond this. Now, I am sure that they will go well beyond this in terms of territory, territorial position within Ukraine. It seems to me that we are now looking definitely at Russian demands for Ukraine to give up much more territory than it was going to give up under the agreement that was reached in March last year. But I cannot help but think that what Nebenzia and the Russians have in mind is a serious discussion with the United States and with the Western powers about the general situation, security situation in Europe. And I'm also going to say that despite protestations, opposition, loud statements that we're going to hear from the West, again, or at least some Western leaders, we're going to object vociferously to sitting down with the Russians and discussing any of these matters. I think an increasing body of opinion, especially in Europe, and perhaps conceivably in the United States, is going to quietly come round to the view, finally, that some negotiations, some discussion with the Russians about the general situation in Europe, the security situation in Europe, is unavoidable. And some substantive agreements, and by that I mean agreements that will take the form of treaties with the Russians on this question, are unavoidable as well. This conflict has not turned out well for the West. The sanctions have failed. The Western economies are now looking at a deepening recession crisis. The attempts to roll back the Russian military by providing enormous amounts of military assistance to Ukraine has been unsuccessful, and the United States itself is increasingly concerned about the fact that Western military arsenals are becoming depleted at a time when the military challenge from China is growing in strength. So I think that perhaps this time a more substantive negotiation will probably take place. And I suspect that we're going to start to see moves to this effect start to crystallize, provided, of course, the neocons aren't able to sabotage them, but will start to emerge late in the autumn, perhaps around October time. We'll see. And as I said, the character of these discussions this time will be different. And by the way, I suspect that civilians in the civilians at the Pentagon itself will, on this occasion, start to take a much more active role in the negotiations, trying to push aside the State Department, as it failed to do during the negotiations that took place in 2021. Now, having said that, some degree of escalation in the meantime cannot unfortunately be excluded. There's more talk about the supply of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. There have been statements from the Pentagon which appear to deny that this is under consideration. We've had this before. The Pentagon opposes something. The White House and the State Department insists on it. They get their allies in Congress to talk about it as well. And the weapons eventually come, even though the Pentagon has made it fairly clear that it is unhappy. Well, I suspect that this is going to repeat itself. I've always suspected that the ATACMS missiles would eventually appear on the scene. There are not that many of them, however. Production apparently ceased some time ago and cannot be resumed easily. The United States needs some of these missiles to confront China, and so they like to say, and I suspect that this is going to be, together with the F-16s, the last throw. I doubt the ATACMS will make much difference. I suspect that the Russian air defense system will be able to counter them as successfully as they have countered the HIMARS and apparently the Storm Shadow missiles, and I predict that before very long, as I said, once that particular round of arms supplies has run its course, the negotiations finally will resume. Anyway, that's my guess about the way things are going. More from me soon, but it's the end of my video today. And in the meantime, just to remind you once more, you can find all our videos on our various channels, on our various platforms, Locals, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. Back soon.